When Robert Baratheon drew his last breath, the Seven Kingdoms stood on a precipice. In that fragile moment, Ned Stark made a choice that would alter the fate of Westeros. Rather than remain in the capital and risk immediate capture by the Lannisters after revealing Cersei's secret, he fled under the cover of darkness alongside Renly Baratheon, who departed King's Landing with a quiet resolution of his own. They rode south, both burdened by the knowledge of the illegitimacy of Joffrey's claim. Renly, though younger and less experienced than his late brother, had charm and ambition aplenty, yet Ned did not see him as a king. Instead, Ned carried a copy of Robert's last will, the ink still fresh, naming him protector of the realm. He was intent on a different path. If Robert's children were not truly his, if the Iron Throne had fallen into the hands of impostors, then the realm needed someone honorable to guide it. It needed Ned Stark. Their journey took them first to the Stormlands, where Renly's sigil still demanded loyalty from knights and lords who had served House Baratheon for generations. They were suspicious of the Northmen's intentions, for who was Ned Stark but a distant guardian of frozen fields? What right did he have to claim the legacy of the Iron Throne? Yet, as Ned spoke plainly of Robert's wishes and of the Lannisters' treachery, the hardened lords of the Stormlands began to nod and scowl at the thought of Lannister rule. Renly himself stood tall beside Ned, silent endorsement of the words spoken. Whatever Renly's personal ambitions had been before, he placed them aside to stand with Ned. He recognized the older man's integrity, the moral backbone that had earned him Robert's trust decades ago. With that quiet alliance sealed, they gathered the banners of Storm's End. The few who hesitated were reminded of the blood spilt to win the crown and the injustice of letting it slide into Lannister hands. Soon, a host of swords and spears rallied behind them. Ned knew he could not stand alone with only Renly's loyalists. He needed the support of his own homeland. Raven after raven flew north, carrying his seal and stern words. The North was vast and proud, and House Stark had ruled it for thousands of years. Many would follow their liege lord wherever he led. To the Riverlands, he sent other messages, appealing to the Tullus and their vassals. His marriage to Catelyn bound him to that region, and he hoped that honor and family would guide them to his side. Perhaps the Blackfish would come, along with the Lannisters and Freys. The Freys were notoriously fickle, but perhaps they could be swayed by promises of favor under a Stark-ruled Iron Throne. Ned tried not to dwell too long on that notion. He had no longing for the crown, but what alternative remained? The realm was splitting at the seams. If not him, who would stand forth with the truth? In the fields and foothills between the Stormlands and King's Landing, Ned drilled his growing forces. He never claimed to be a great war leader, but he knew strategy and had fought in Robert's rebellion. He understood that if he moved too slowly, the Lannisters would have time to consolidate power. With Tywin's gold and cunning, they would fortify the capital and rally mercenaries. So Ned moved swiftly, never tarrying too long, pressing onward before reports of his gathering armies reached the Red Keep. To the soldiers, he was not a fiery presence. His commands were simple, his judgments fair. Men who fought for him knew they would not be sacrificed lightly. He inspired loyalty, if not with rousing speeches, then with quiet steadiness and the conviction that theirs was a righteous cause. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, the Lannisters scrambled. Joffrey sat the throne, a crown too large for his head, and Cersei whispered her venom into his ear. She would know by now that Ned had escaped with Renly, that he had Robert's last testament. News of the North stirring would have reached them. The gold cloaks and the few knights still loyal to the crown would hold the city walls. But would the common folk rally behind a boy king born of incest? Whispers spread through Flea Bottom and along the Street of Steel that Ned Stark had escaped to challenge the pretender. Some began to think well of that honorable Northman who dared to oppose the Lions. Others were simply afraid that war would come to their doorsteps once again. Renly rode beside Ned at the head of the host. Though Renly had not declared himself king in this turning of fate, he carried the weight of House Baratheon's reputation. With Robert gone, the faith of many Stormlords had shifted to Renly as the natural successor. They saw Ned Stark as a protector and regent, perhaps even a claim to a throne under the pretense of Robert's will. Some knights whispered that Ned would seat himself as king, but few could imagine him wearing a crown. Yet what other choice was there if Stannis remained at Dragonstone, brooding and unconvinced, and if the boy on the Iron Throne was no true Baratheon? Renly may have wanted that throne for himself once, but in this new arrangement, he seemed content to let Ned guide the realm, at least until order was restored. As they marched northward along the King's Road, the countryside stirred like a hive of restless bees. Some small folk fled at the sight of banners, no matter who bore them. Others rushed out to beg for protection or bread. Ned, still bound by his code, tried to maintain discipline. Pillaging was forbidden. He would not become another tyrant. His men grumbled, for war was cruel and supplies scarce. But Ned argued that if they won the throne through brutality, they would inherit nothing but ashes. He sent messengers ahead with promises of fair treatment, encouraging villagers to sell what they could spare. Gold, not the plunder of steel, filled the wagons. Renly supported this approach, and it created a fragile but important bond with the small folk. If Ned won, they would remember who treated them kindly. With time, more riders joined their number, carrying news that lords of the Riverlands were mustering. The Tullus, reluctant to break faith with the crown without proof, received Ned's ravens and weighed the truth of his words against the loyalty they owed. But Ned had been a good husband to Catelyn, and they trusted his honor. They began sending armsmen southward, not declaring openly yet, but preparing for what might come. Fry remained hesitant, as did several smaller houses, but the tide was turning. If Ned Stark truly aimed to unseat the Lannisters, he would need as many allies as he could muster. Ned's host grew steadily, and with each new ally came new murmurs. Who would sit the Iron Throne once the impostors were driven out? The question lingered, unanswered. Some proposed Stannis as the rightful heir by laws of succession, but Stannis had not shown himself. Others demanded that Ned place the crown on his own head, arguing that a stable, just ruler was needed, and that Robert's will gave him a right to rule as protector until a proper heir was found. Ned tried to quiet such talk, insisting that he was acting out of duty, not ambition. Yet the realm needed stability, and if Stannis would not come forth, if Renly did not press his claim, who was left but Ned? He had been Robert's closest friend, the man he trusted above all others. He alone held the testament that named him protector. Perhaps, in the minds of many, that was reason enough. As they neared the capital, scouts brought word that Lannister bannermen had been spotted west of the city. Tywin might be marching to reinforce his grandchildren's hold on power. Lannister archers and knights would make it a fierce contest. Ned knew that King's Landing's garrison was still sizable, and the Kingsguard remained at Joffrey's side. A direct assault would be costly. The memories of the last time King's Landing fell lingered in the minds of older veterans. Robert's rebellion had seen the city sacked once before. Did Ned want to repeat that horror? Uncertainty gnawed at him. He had never wanted this fight. He had tried to preserve the realm's peace, to honor the memory of his old friend. Yet here he was, at the head of an army, poised to bring bloodshed to the crown's seat of power. Renly tried to reassure him, reminding Ned that they fought for justice. They fought to unmask treachery. If the boy on the throne was not rightful, then every law of gods and men demanded correction. But Ned worried that justice might drown in a tide of steel and screams. Still, he had started this path and could not turn back now. He had declared himself in defiance of the false king, and if he retreated, the realm would collapse into chaos. The only way forward was through King's Landing's gates, to remove the Lannisters and re-establish a lawful monarch. All the while, he asked himself if he truly could wear a crown without losing part of himself. He wondered if the North would accept a Stark on the Iron Throne, or if this was a passing madness that fate had thrust upon him. As the army drew closer to King's Landing, the tension wound tighter with each passing league. Scouts galloped back and forth, delivering reports and warnings. Tywin Lannister, notorious for his swiftness in response, had indeed begun to move. His bannermen were stirring, likely marching from the west to secure the capital for his grandson and daughter. If Ned delayed, The host inside King's Landing might swell to a size too daunting to dislodge. Every day that passed counted against him, but Ned refused to abandon caution entirely. He positioned men to watch the roads from the west, hoping to halt any attempt at relief before it reached the city. His allies from the Riverlands were still moving into place. The Tully influence had swayed some hesitant bannermen, and more swords joined Ned's host. Even some hedge knights and free riders arrived, their loyalty forged by promises of just rule. The presence of Renly Baratheon, though he did not claim the crown, lent legitimacy in the eyes of many. After all, Renly was a Baratheon of the Stormlands, and the Iron Throne had passed to Robert from the Targaryens by right of conquest. If Ned Stark intended to restore lawful succession, the involvement of a Baratheon, even one who did not style himself king, might ease the doubts of lords who feared treason. Still, the question of kingship lingered. As the banners of wolves and stags flapped in the breeze, Ned thought often of his family. He wondered if Catelyn knew what he had done, what he had become. He had always tried to live a life guided by honor, to avoid unnecessary wars, to serve as Warden of the North with dignity. Now he risked open conflict that could set half the realm aflame. He imagined Catelyn's response. She understood duty, he knew that. Family, duty, honor had always guided her just as starkly as honor, duty, and loyalty guided him. Still, would she approve of this course, of her husband placing himself in the line of succession by sheer necessity? He could almost hear her counsel. Win the war first, then worry over crowns. When at last the outskirts of King's Landing appeared, the host faced a grim reality. The gold cloaks patrolled the walls, their presence bolstered by Lannister men-at-arms. Archers lined the battlements. The city's gates were closed and fortified. To attempt a direct assault might cause a bloodbath. Ned sent envoys under a flag of truce, offering terms. He did not demand the city's sack, he did not call for unnecessary slaughter, but he insisted that Joffrey Baratheon step down. He presented copies of Robert's will, citing his authority as protector. He demanded the surrender of Cersei Lannister and the Kingsguard who defied the rightful order of succession. His messengers returned empty-handed, reporting only that the Lannisters had laughed at their requests and threatened to hang the next envoy from the city walls. Renly urged a show of strength. Bring forth siege engines, encircle the city, starve them out if necessary. Yet time was not on their side. Tywin Lannister's approach was rumored to be imminent. If they lingered too long, they would find themselves between the walls of King's Landing and a powerful western host. Ned considered the old lessons of warfare. Robert's rebellion had ended with a swift strike against the capital, aided by the betrayal of certain elements within the city. Would anyone in King's Landing, weary of Lannister rule, open the gates now? He dispatched riders with subtle hints of pardon and gold if the city guard would turn coat. He had no desire to make bribes, but if it could prevent a prolonged siege, it might be necessary. The days dragged on, filled with tense waiting. Knights tested their mettle with justs outside the city's arrow range. Infantry drilled ceaselessly, preparing for what might become a brutal storming of the walls. The Riverlords arrived, bolstering Ned's lines, their banners mingling with those of the Stormlands and the North. More messages from the North arrived. The armies of House Stark were on the move. Robb Stark had assumed command there, a boy turning into a young lord who might soon wage war of his own. If the Lannisters reached the capital, if they pressed this to open conflict, the realm would bleed once more as it had during the rebellion that ousted the Targaryens. In his tent one evening, Ned brooded over a table map. He considered whether there was a true solution that would avoid bloodshed. Could he call a great council and lay out the truth? It was madness to think Cersei would ever allow it. If Stannis Baratheon emerged from Dragonstone, perhaps this burden would not fall so heavily on Ned's shoulders. Stannis, by right of birth, should be Robert's heir, but Stannis had not appeared. Some whispers claimed he was mustering ships and men, but until he declared himself, Ned had only rumors. Others spoke of distant dragons, scattered Targaryens that might lay claim to the Iron Throne again. But Ned had lived through the madness of the Mad King, and he would not see the realm tossed to another Targaryen claimant without good reason. At last, faced with no better alternative, Ned resolved to force King's Landing's hand. He arranged his army in a broad crescent, displaying strength without launching a direct attack. He would threaten the outlying granaries and the roads that fed the city. If the Lannisters would not parley, he would squeeze them slowly. He ordered his captains to ride along the perimeter, ensuring discipline remained intact. No looting, no raping, no cruelty. They would not lose the moral high ground. They would be the liberators, if such a title could even be claimed in the messy business of war. Villagers brought what spare provisions they could, selling at fair rates. Some reported that the city's common folk had begun to mutter against the boy king. The price of bread had risen, and fear of starvation turned hearts against Lannister rule. One night, when the crescent moon hung low, a messenger arrived under heavy guard. He was from the city watch, bearing a tentative offer. If Ned Stark promised clemency and fair treatment, some of the gold cloaks might open the gates at dawn. They had grown uneasy, torn between service to Joffrey and their duty to the realm. Many remembered Ned Stark's reputation for honor, and they would rather serve a protector who put the kingdom's welfare before personal gain. Ned, relieved at the prospect of avoiding a bloody siege, wrote a formal promise of amnesty to the city watch and any lord who would stand down when the gates opened. He pressed his seal into hot wax, praying this would be the end of it. Come dawn, Ned's host stood ready. Spears gleamed in the early light, horses snorted and pawed the ground. All eyes were on the mighty gates of King's Landing. Tense minutes passed, then hours. Just when impatience began to set in, the gates creaked. A horn sounded, one long note. The gates opened. Gold cloaks emerged, holding their swords high but pointed away from Ned's army. A handful of them carried a large banner, white in color, a signal of peace. Ned urged his horse forward, Renly at his side, along with a contingent of trusted men. The gold cloaks lowered their weapons and offered no resistance. The small folk, terrified but curious, peered from windows and alleys. Ned ordered his men to hold, then rode through the gates, banners of the direwolf and crowned stag swirling behind him. Inside, tension crackled like dry tinder. The Lannisters within the Red Keep must have realized their position was weakening. Perhaps some had fled during the night. Maybe the Kingsguard would make a final stand before the Iron Throne. Step by careful step, Ned's forces spread through the streets, maintaining formation. He would not allow chaos. He ordered that any Lannister soldiers who surrendered their arms be taken as prisoners, not executed on the spot. Word traveled fast. The people watched the arrival of the North's Lord, marveling at his calm command. At the Red Keep's walls, a standoff formed. A handful of sworn swords and gold cloaks remained loyal to the false king. Cersei and Joffrey might still be inside, screaming and plotting. Ned raised his voice, calling for them to yield. He promised a fair trial, a proper hearing. No response came. For a moment, Ned feared he would have to fight for every inch of ground. But then, something changed. One of the Kingsguard knights stepped forward, removed his helm, and declared his intention to lay down arms if justice, not butchery, would rule the day. This act, carried out in front of common folk and soldiers alike, broke the last resistance. The gates to the Red Keep opened, and a handful of guards escorted out a pale, furious Cersei and a trembling Joffrey. Ned dismounted. He stood before them, grim and tired. He had not wanted this throne, this burden, but fate had dragged him here. The Iron Throne loomed behind, that cruel seat forged of 1,000 swords. Would he now claim it? The people murmured, some calling out for Ned to restore order, others begging him to name himself king and spare them further conflict. Renly watched, neither contesting Ned's authority nor offering his own claim. For Ned Stark, honor and duty weighed more than gold or glory. He was protector by Robert's last decree, and now, unless Stannis came to claim his birthright or unless some other lawful solution appeared, he might be forced to wear a crown made of swords.